The hall shimmered with elegance, lights glowing overhead, laughter echoing from polished walls, the hum of wealth and status threading through conversations like an unspoken code. Dorian Hale stood at the heart of it all. Tailored suit, controlled expression, every move calculated. In his world, nothing was left to chance. His name alone could sway markets, silence critics, or open closed doors. People didn't speak to him, they deferred. He scanned the room once more, glass in hand, his presence enough to draw attention without saying a word. But as he turned toward the stage, his body froze. A figure stood near the corner of the room, adjusting a row of donation envelopes. She wasn't trying to stand out. She didn't wear diamonds or silk. There was a quiet strength in her posture, a stillness that pushed the noise into the background. Dorian's breath caught. She turned. Ilara. His hand slipped. The glass crashed to the floor. Before his mind could process anything, two children appeared beside her, twins. A boy and a girl. The boy looked up, his eyes a near replica of Dorian's own. Sharp, intelligent, unmistakable. The girl leaned into Ilara's side, her expression soft, curious, and achingly familiar. Dorian staggered back a step. He tried to speak, but no words came. His chest constricted. Air vanished. A low hum filled his ears. The room tilted sideways. Someone called his name. Then everything went black. If you believe in second chances, or you've ever loved someone so deeply, it hurt. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story. You won't want to miss what happens next. What if one glance could shatter your world, not with fear, but with truth you thought you'd buried forever? Dorian's eyes opened to a ceiling he didn't recognize. Sterile white, soft beeping in the background. The air smelled of antiseptic and quiet urgency. He tried to sit up. A firm hand eased him back. "Don't move yet," someone said gently. "You collapsed." "Do you know where you are?" Collapsed? His mind scrambled, clawing through fog. The question didn't make sense, not when his chest was still echoing with the image of those eyes, not when that name still sat, unspoken on the edge of his tongue. Ilara. The room around him vanished. In its place, a memory broke through the surface, uninvited and sharp. It had been late autumn, 9 years earlier. They were in the middle of an argument, though neither raised their voice. That was never their way. Ilara stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself, not from cold, but from a growing distance between them that neither knew how to cross. "You're building a future," she had said, eyes heavy. "Just not one that includes me." He had turned away, unable to answer. When the door closed that night, it didn't slam. It whispered, and he never opened it again, until now. His heartbeat spiked as the memory faded. His hand gripped the thin hospital sheet, grounding himself in the present, but the images wouldn't let go. The children, their faces, the impossible reflection in the boy's eyes. A quiet knock drew his attention. And there she was. She stepped in slowly, almost cautiously, holding a paper cup in both hands. No makeup, no pretense, just her. Even after all this time, Ilara moved like grace in motion. She didn't speak at first. Neither did he. Silence pressed between them, not awkward, not angry, just full. She finally broke it. "You passed out," she said softly, almost like she was still deciding whether she should have come at all. Dorian nodded faintly, eyes searching hers. "Ilara." It was barely a whisper. Her gaze held him for a beat. "They're mine," she said. "Ours." 9 years of ambition had built him a kingdom. But in one moment, a quiet voice reminded him of everything he never truly let go of. He didn't respond right away. How could he? There were no boardrooms, no polished statements, no controlled narratives for this moment. Only the sound of his heart pounding inside a body that once felt untouchable. "They're mine. Ours." His mind tried to deny it. It was too much, too fast. But something deeper, instinctive, undeniable, told him it was true. The boy's eyes had said what words hadn't. So had the girl's gentle stare. Have you ever buried a love so deep you convinced yourself it never existed? Because facing it felt too risky, too vulnerable, too permanent. That's what he had done. He didn't walk away from love. He shut the door and threw the key into the fire of ambition. Now, here it was again, living, breathing. 8 years old, his children. A sharp breath escaped him. Shame followed closely behind. How many birthdays had passed without him? How many stories, scraped knees, school drawings, tooth fairy notes had happened in his absence? I didn't know, he murmured. I tried, Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. You didn't want to be found. Her words weren't meant to punish, but they landed like a sentence. He thought back to the silence after their parting, the unanswered calls he never knew about, the letters that never reached him, walls built by ambition, reinforced by pride, walls that kept out the very thing he thought he didn't need. Now they were standing in front of him, Alara, and the pieces of himself he never even knew had gone missing. How do you ask for forgiveness when you didn't even know you were wrong? How do you catch up on years you never lived? He didn't know, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Will you stay long enough to see what destiny had planned for the man who gained the world, but forgot his own blood? The silence between them remained unbroken for several heartbeats. But within Dorian, everything had changed. The empire he'd spent years constructing, the title, the accolades, the power, it all felt weightless now, as if stripped of meaning the moment he looked into the eyes of a son he never knew, and a daughter who carried the warmth he thought he had buried with his past. Alara didn't ask for answers. She didn't need explanations. She had lived them. She stood, gently placing the untouched paper cup on the side table. They're outside, she said. When you're ready. Dorian swallowed, the knot in his throat too heavy to speak around. He managed only a nod. As the door clicked softly behind her, he leaned back, staring at the ceiling once more, but this time not with detachment. This time with the weight of 1,000 missed moments pressing down on his chest. And yet, within that weight, a door cracked open. He didn't know what came next, but he knew what he couldn't do. He couldn't disappear again. Not from them, not from her. The boardroom was silent, not out of confusion, not hesitation, but reverence. Dorian Hale stood at the head of the table, flanked by projections of quarterly reports, market charts, and expansion forecasts. Every seat was filled. Every executive leaned forward, pens poised, faces tense. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When Dorian spoke, people listened. When he paused, they waited. His presence did what most men needed entire teams to accomplish. The numbers he presented were clean, unshakable, profitable. Growth was up. Shareholders were pleased. A new acquisition was already underway, one that would expand their reach into 3 new global sectors. A slight nod from Dorian signaled the meeting's end. He closed his tablet, buttoned his suit jacket, and left the room without another word. No handshakes, no goodbyes. He didn't linger. He never did. Outside the boardroom, his assistant matched his stride, listing the day's obligations like clockwork. Investor debrief in 20 minutes. Interview with Business World at 2 p.m. Cars waiting downstairs. Would you like to confirm your attendance for the advisory dinner tonight? Dorian barely turned his head. No. A pause. The assistant blinked but didn't press. Understood. The car door opened the moment his shoes hit the pavement. He slid into the back seat, leather immaculate, windows tinted. The city passed by in a blur as the driver merged into traffic. Dorian glanced out but didn't see it. Not really. His mind was elsewhere, wired to strategy, timing, performance. But even now, there was a dullness to it all. The same meetings, the same conversations, the same circle of influence. Everything worked. Everything ran smoothly. It was just silent, not the kind of silence that brought peace, the kind that haunted. By the time he reached the studio for the interview, the crew had already adjusted the lighting and prepped the set. The host greeted him with polished charm. Mr. Hale, it's an honor. He offered a nod. No smile. The interview began. Questions about leadership, sacrifice, market dominance, growth, vision. His answers were crisp, clear, predictable in their precision. But at one point, the host asked, "You've built one of the most successful private equity firms in the country, yet you remain a deeply private man. What drives you, Mr. Hale?" For a second, just a second, his gaze flickered. What drives you? He cleared his throat. Results, he replied smoothly. Stability, discipline. The host smiled and moved on. No one noticed the way his fingers had tensed on the armrest. Back in the car, he loosened his collar and checked the time. His penthouse wasn't far. Another building with his name on the deed. Luxury, glass walls, stainless finishes, automated everything. He stepped into the space like a visitor, not a resident. There was no warmth, no mess, nothing personal, just pristine silence. He poured himself a glass of water, sat down, removed his watch, placed it neatly on the counter, and then just sat there. No music, no calls, no conversation, just the hum of a refrigerator and the quiet tap of ice melting in glass. Night settled over the skyline, and the city's lights flickered beneath the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of Dorian's penthouse. He stood before them, arms crossed, staring blankly out at the view others would envy. Skyscrapers blinked like watchful eyes. The streets below buzzed with life, horns, footsteps, moments being made. But up here, there was only stillness. He wasn't afraid of quiet. He had always believed it signaled control. Yet tonight, it felt different. Empty. A notification from an investor, another from his legal team, routine updates, all handled. He scrolled through the messages like someone browsing someone else's life. Cold, precise, functional. He closed the phone and set it aside. He didn't need more power. He had it. He didn't need approval. He had that too. He had wealth, access, influence, everything he once believed would make him invincible. But somewhere along the climb, he had left something behind. Or maybe someone. He walked through the space, immaculate, curated, designed to impress. The kitchen counters gleamed. The shelves held books no one read. The wine rack was full but untouched. The dining table, long and modern, hadn't hosted a single meal in over a year. He paused in the hallway, where 3 framed photos hung. They were chosen by an interior designer, not because they meant anything, but because they matched the color palette. There was nothing in this space that bore his soul. Only evidence of achievement. No childhood photos, no fingerprints, no memories. The elevator chimed. His assistant had arranged for the next morning's documents to be delivered, early prep for a potential merger. The courier handed him a package. "Have a good night, sir." Dorian nodded, then closed the door. He placed the envelope on the counter and didn't open it. Instead, he returned to the windows. It had been 9 years since he'd last seen Alara, since he'd let himself care about anyone not tied to a contract. It hadn't always been this way. There had been a time. Quiet dinners, soft laughter, plans that didn't involve board votes. But ambition had demanded sacrifice, and he had offered everything. In the silence, his reflection stared back at him from the glass. Sharp suit, chiseled features, unreadable eyes. To the world, he was unshakable. But in that still moment, he saw it. Loneliness isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It just waits. It waits in the spaces between meetings. It waits behind closed doors. It waits in the heart of a man who has everything, except anyone. Back at his desk, he reviewed the briefing packet, his focus as sharp as ever. But the echo of something long buried had begun to stir. It wasn't loud, but it wouldn't go away. Long before the power, the suits, and the stone-walled boardrooms, there was a version of Dorian Hale that most never knew. Back then, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a man with a vision and a burning desire to make something of himself. Driven, intense, focused to a fault. And then there was Alara. She'd entered his life like she wasn't trying to change it, only to walk beside it. She worked at the independent bookstore across from his apartment, tucked between a bakery and a dry cleaner. He'd passed it a dozen times and never noticed, until the day it started raining and he ducked inside for shelter. She looked up from a stack of books and smiled. That smile would undo years of guarded ambition without a word. Their first conversation wasn't extraordinary. He asked if they sold coffee. She said no, but handed him a cup anyway, from her own thermos. He stayed for 20 minutes, then an hour. Then he came back the next day, and the next. They were opposites in so many ways. She had a softness that never asked for permission to exist. She believed in people, in long walks without a destination, in saving birthday cards, in listening without needing to fix things. He was all deadlines and future planning, strategy and logic. He rarely looked back, only forward. But somehow, it worked. Their rhythm wasn't built on perfect compatibility. It was built on presence. She slowed him down, made space in his life where there had never been any. Evenings turned into shared dinners on her tiny balcony. Sunday mornings were spent flipping through second-hand novels at the market. He began reading poetry, not because he loved it, but because she did, and because he loved hearing her read it. She never asked him to change, and yet, around her, he became different. Softer, more open, more human. But ambition has sharp edges, and Dorian's path to success demanded more and more of him. Late nights bled into missed calls. Canceled plans turned into forgotten birthdays. She understood, at first, but understanding has limits. She never complained. She never shouted. What she did was harder. She stayed kind. She stayed patient. Until patience turned into quiet heartbreak. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, subtle. A missed dinner here, a rescheduled weekend there. Small moments that once brought joy were replaced with apologetic texts and empty promises. Dorian was climbing. He'd landed a position with a powerful investment firm. The kind of opportunity that consumed everything in its path. Time, energy, relationships. He believed it was necessary. He believed Alara would understand. She tried, but her eyes began to lose their spark when he entered a room. Her voice, once light and playful, became softer, careful. One night she cooked his favorite meal, slow-roasted lamb with rosemary and garlic, the kind that took hours. He came home late. He didn't touch the plate. Instead, he handed her a contract to read. An expansion opportunity, he said. London wants me. Her fingers trembled as she held the paper. When would you go? In a few months. Maybe sooner. She nodded, eyes lowered. And me? There was a pause. I don't know, he said, and with those words, the fracture widened. His parents never approved of her. They weren't unkind, just calculating. She was sweet, they said, but not aligned with your long-term trajectory. Alara didn't grow up wealthy. She didn't network. She didn't wear the right names or move in the right circles. Dorian thought he could protect her from that side of things. But voices behind closed doors have a way of slipping through. One afternoon, she showed him a letter. Anonymously sent, typed, unsigned. Cold words warning her to let him go for his sake. I didn't want to tell you, she whispered. But maybe this is the world you belong to. And maybe it isn't mine. He crumpled the letter and threw it across the room. Swore he'd find out who sent it. But part of him already knew. The last time they spoke in person was quiet. She had packed 2 boxes, books, a sweater of his, a few letters he once wrote in the early days. He offered to help her carry them down. She refused. At the door, she hesitated. Love isn't supposed to feel like waiting, she said. I kept thinking you'd come back, but I think I've been standing still while you moved on. His throat tightened. I didn't move on, he said. You didn't stay either. She didn't tell him she was pregnant. Not then. She had intended to. She even rehearsed it in her head. But something held her back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe fear. Maybe the quiet realization that he no longer saw the life they once imagined the same way she did. He'd always been unreachable when he was hurt. And she was hurting. She tried calling 2 weeks later. No answer. She wrote a letter. No reply. She left messages. Nothing returned. She didn't know that his number had changed. That her letters never made it past the doorman. That someone in his circle had made sure nothing reached him. And by the time she realized, too much time had passed. Too much silence had settled in. She stopped reaching out and started preparing for a life on her own. She raised the twins without fanfare, without rage, without resentment. But every now and then, on birthdays, school plays, quiet nights, she would look at them and remember the man who didn't even know they existed. Not out of cruelty, but because somewhere along the way, he chose something else. The ballroom pulsed with elegance. Crystal fixtures hung from high ceilings. Waitstaff glided through with trays of champagne. Conversations flowed, calculated and polite. Mergers, campaigns, donor brackets. The evening was dressed in luxury. Dorian Hale stood apart, as he always did. Not because he demanded space, but because people instinctively gave it to him. His presence carried weight, precision, legacy. He moved through the room with quiet confidence, offering curt nods, brief handshakes, and minimal words. No one questioned it. That was his nature. His assistant handed him a tablet. The speech draft is ready for review. He nodded, scanning it briefly. I'll deliver it from memory. Of course he would. That was Dorian Hale. He walked toward the back corridor to prepare for the stage. As he did, something shifted. Not in the lighting. Not in the air. In him. A flicker of something caught the corner of his eye. Barely there. He turned his head just slightly. There, by the reception table, among a group of staff and volunteers, stood a woman sorting envelopes into trays. She wasn't facing him, but he knew. He knew the curve of her shoulder, the quiet grace in her movement, the stillness she carried even when surrounded by motion. She straightened, turning slightly, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. It was her, Alara. 9 years vanished in a blink. His breath caught. It couldn't be. Not here. Not tonight. But the mind doesn't lie about the things it never truly forgets. She hadn't changed much. There was a different weight in her posture now. Not heaviness, depth, the kind earned through years of standing alone when no one was looking. She didn't wear anything flashy. Her dress was simple, her hair pulled back, no attempt to be noticed. And yet, Dorian couldn't see anything else. His footsteps slowed. He forgot the stage, the donors, the event bearing his name. It was like watching his past unfold in front of him, alive, breathing, real. She turned. Their eyes met. Time didn't slow. It stopped. Shock flickered across her face. Not dramatic, not fearful, just sharp recognition. And something else, something unreadable. He opened his mouth. Ayla. Mom. A child's voice cut through the space. Dorian's head turned toward it instinctively. 2 children ran toward her from the far end of the hall, one on each side. A boy and a girl. The boy reached her first, clutching her hand like it was home. The girl hugged her waist, beaming. Alara bent down, whispering something to them. They nodded, and then they looked up. The boy's gaze locked with Dorian's. It hit like a punch to the chest. Those eyes. They were his. Not metaphorically, not figuratively, they were his. The same intense focus, the same shape, the same expression he saw in the mirror every morning. His legs stiffened beneath him. The girl tilted her head slightly. There it was, Alara's kindness in miniature. That same gentle stare that once unraveled his defenses without trying. He took a step back. The air grew thin. His throat closed. A sound, maybe his own breath, maybe something deeper, escaped him, but he didn't hear it clearly. A flash, a dizzying spin. His hand reached out toward something, someone, but caught only air. The floor rose to meet him. And then, darkness. The room didn't erupt, but it shifted, the kind of shift that happens when control slips through fingers too used to holding power. Someone called for help. Another voice, sharper, cut across the room. Call medical, now. Dorian lay motionless. His suit, pristine only seconds ago, now looked too tight against a body that suddenly seemed too human. The man who was always 5 steps ahead had fallen without warning. Alara was already moving. She pushed through the small crowd forming near him, staff instinctively parting for her. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She just moved. She reached his side as someone crouched down to check his pulse. A man she didn't know was muttering medical protocol. Alara barely heard him. Her focus was on Dorian. His face was pale, lips parted slightly, brow tight, like he was still trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her heart pounded, not just from the fall, but from what led to it. He had seen them. He had seen the children. The twins stood a few feet away, confused. Is he hurt? The girl asked, her voice barely audible. Alara turned her head. Stay back, baby. It's okay. Why was he looking at us like that? The boy asked. He wasn't afraid. He was searching for something. Recognition, maybe. A name. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Dorian was conscious again, but disoriented. His eyes fluttered open, flickered toward the ceiling, then to Alara's face. There was no denying what was real anymore. She was here. They were here. The life he thought had ended had never stopped breathing. It had simply grown up without him. Where? He tried to speak. Don't, she whispered, brushing a hand near his shoulder to calm him. You fainted. Let them check you first. He closed his eyes again. Not from pain, but from the weight. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, one of the paramedics asked, You know this man? Alara hesitated for a split second, then nodded. Yes, I do. They began wheeling him toward the exit, the crowd respectfully distant but curious. Whispers trailed in their wake. Alara turned back briefly to the children. Wait right here. I'll be right back. They nodded, trusting her, always trusting her. In the ambulance, the silence stretched between them like a fragile thread. Dorian finally spoke. I saw them. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. She didn't deflect. You did, she replied. A beat passed. They're mine. They're ours, she corrected gently. The words landed heavy. He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on nothing. Alara, why didn't you? Her voice interrupted before the question finished. I tried. That was all she said. That was all she needed to say. There would be time for answers. For pain. For the story neither of them had finished telling. But for now, he closed his eyes again, letting the hum of the vehicle carry him forward, toward a truth he could no longer escape. And maybe, didn't want to, would you forgive someone after 9 years? A love lost, a truth hidden, and a reunion no one saw coming. Drop your answer in the comments below. Let's talk about it. The hospital room was still, curtains drawn, machines steady, a vase of artificial flowers on the side table, the only color in a space built for waiting. Dorian opened his eyes slowly. The ceiling again, the same sterile lights as before, but this time his mind was clear, and he wasn't alone. Alara sat in the chair near the window, knees crossed, hands resting in her lap, not tense, not fidgeting, just still. She hadn't touched her coffee. She looked like she'd been there a while. He turned his head toward her. Her eyes met his, but she didn't smile. She didn't cry either. That was never her way. How long have I been out? He asked, voice low, hoarse. A few hours, she replied. There was a beat of silence, thick but not bitter. His throat worked before he found the words. They're mine. She nodded. Yes. Why didn't I know? Her hands folded tighter in her lap. She drew a breath, calm and measured. I found out I was pregnant about 3 weeks after I left. Her voice didn't waver. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the kind of truth that had been lived through, not memorized. I called. Your number had changed. I left messages at your firm. Nothing. He frowned. I know, she said, gently. I'm not accusing you. Another pause. I mailed you a letter, twice. I went to your old apartment. They said you'd moved. The door staff wouldn't give me a forwarding address. Said it was against policy. He exhaled, jaw clenched. My mother even tried your office line. They told her you didn't take unscheduled calls. That made something tighten behind his ribs. I should have tried harder, he said. Alara tilted her head. You shouldn't have had to try. We were us. I never thought you wouldn't come back. Her words weren't angry. They were just tired. She looked down briefly. I almost told your mother. I thought maybe she'd give you the message. His brows furrowed. You spoke to her? She nodded once. She said, very kindly, that you were doing well, that you were on the cusp of something important, that it would be best for everyone if we moved on. Dorian's hands gripped the blanket covering him. She knew. She didn't say the words, but I understood what she meant. He didn't speak, because what was there to say? He could argue, defend, try to explain that he hadn't known, that it wasn't his fault, but none of it mattered. She had been alone, and he had been gone. I stopped reaching out after that, Alara continued, her voice even, not cold, just honest. I kept thinking, maybe you'd come back, maybe you'd hear something, maybe you'd find me, but time passed, and silence turned into reality. She looked at him again. I didn't want to chase someone who chose something else, so I let go. Dorian's hand moved to his chest. Not from pain, at least not the physical kind. How did you manage? Alara gave the faintest shrug, same way anyone does. One day at a time. He waited. She continued. I worked at the bookstore for a while. Then I picked up hours at a community center. Nights were tough, especially when they were babies, but we made it. She smiled. Just a little. They're good kids, smart, kind, funny in ways I don't always understand. They're a little quiet around strangers, but once they open up, you can't get them to stop talking. Dorian swallowed, something tight catching in his throat. They've always asked about their father, she said. I told them he was someone I cared for, someone I lost. She didn't add anything else. Didn't have to. They don't hate you, she said after a pause. I wouldn't blame them if they did. They don't know enough to hate you, she replied. That's worse. Her words weren't meant to wound, but they landed all the same. They've never known what it's like to be disappointed by you, because they've never expected you to be there in the first place. He turned his head away, jaw tight, breath shallow. It would have been easier if she had shouted, if she had thrown something, cursed, demanded answers. But she didn't. She just sat there, steady. The same woman he once loved for her peace. Now the woman who carried his children into the world while he lived like they didn't exist. I wanted to be angry, she admitted quietly. In the beginning I was, and now? Now? She looked at him with tired eyes. Now I'm just focused on what they need. Anger doesn't feed them, doesn't help them sleep, doesn't teach them how to love. Silence filled the room again. Dorian felt it press into his lungs, his spine, his ribs. Every achievement, every award, every headline with his name etched in gold. It all seemed irrelevant now. What mattered had been happening without him, and now it stared him in the face. I don't expect you to fix anything, she said, standing slowly. I didn't come here to guilt you. He looked up. Then, why did you? Her expression softened, not with forgiveness but something close. Because they deserve to know who they come from, and because I needed to see if there was anything left of the man I once knew. She paused at the door. I'll give you time. But not forever. Then she was gone. And Dorian Hale, man of power and precision, was left alone with the one thing he had spent his whole life outrunning: regret. The next afternoon, Dorian stood outside a modest townhome on a quiet street just outside the city's center. It was nothing like the places he was used to. No towering gates, no private valet, no coded elevators. Just a small wooden porch, potted plants, and 2 bicycles leaned against the railing. He checked the address again. Yes, this was the place. He shifted the weight of the gift bags in his hands. Designer wrapping paper, brand names discreetly marked, the kind of things he assumed children would find exciting. He hadn't known what to bring, so he brought everything, and still, he felt unprepared. The door opened before he knocked. Alara. She looked at him for a long second. No smile, no hostility, just a cautious stillness. They're inside, she said quietly, stepping aside. Come in. He walked into a space filled with the signs of a real home. Not wealth, but life. Books stacked in a corner, a drawing taped to the refrigerator, a small scuff on the hardwood floor near the hallway. He took it all in silently. They're in the living room, she said. They know you're coming. Dorian's throat tightened. He turned the corner. 2 pairs of eyes turned to meet him. The boy was seated on the rug, building something with colorful blocks, focused, serious, precise. The girl sat cross-legged with a stuffed bear in her lap, watching him with quiet curiosity. They didn't smile. They didn't run. They simply waited. Dorian cleared his throat, the sound too loud in the soft room. Hi. Silence. I brought something for you. He set the bags on the floor. Still no reaction. He reached inside, pulling out one item after another, an electric train set, a high-end tablet, a drone still in its packaging. The children exchanged a look, then turned back to him. The girl spoke first. We don't really use that kind of stuff. Not rude, just honest. The boy tilted his head. We already have toys. Dorian gave a small, awkward chuckle. Right. Of course you do. He stood there, unsure what to do with his hands. This wasn't a boardroom. There were no scripts, no metrics, just 2 children whose lives he hadn't been part of. I'm Ava, the girl said after a moment. Her voice was light, but steady. I'm Caleb, the boy followed. Dorian nodded slowly. Hi, Ava. Hi, Caleb. They nodded back. Ava stood and walked over to Alara, whispering something. Alara bent down, listened, then nodded. She wants to know if you're staying for dinner, Alara said aloud. Dorian blinked. If that's okay. Alara looked at the kids. Is it okay with you? Ava shrugged. I guess. Caleb didn't respond. He went back to his blocks. Dorian sat down carefully on the edge of the couch. He watched the boy work in silence, admiring the way he concentrated, measuring, adjusting, rebuilding when something wasn't right. So much like himself. Too much. After a few quiet minutes, Caleb looked up. Are you really my dad? The question hung in the air like a wire pulled tight. Dorian's mouth opened, but the words didn't come out. He looked at Alara. She gave no signal. This was his to answer. He turned back to Caleb. "I am," he said quietly. "Yes." Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't smile either. "Why weren't you here before?" Ava looked up now, watching both of them. Dorian felt the weight of every missed year in that moment. The birthdays, the school plays, the first teeth, the tears. He drew a breath. "I didn't know," he said honestly. "I should have. But I didn't." Caleb stared at him. Then, slowly, he nodded once. "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it wasn't rejection either. It was a start. That night they ate spaghetti at a small round table with mismatched chairs and chipped plates. Ava talked the most, about school, her favorite books, and how her brother once tried to build a rocket from soda bottles. Caleb spoke less, but laughed when the spaghetti slipped off Ava's fork and hit the floor. Dorian smiled without meaning to. The food was simple, the conversation unpolished, and it was the best evening he'd had in years. Saturday morning was supposed to be simple. Dorian had woken early, determined to do something right. Breakfast, he had told himself, standing in Alara's modest kitchen at 7:15 a.m. Start there. He had Googled a recipe, watched a video twice, bought the best ingredients on his way in, a bag filled with organic eggs, artisanal flour, imported syrup, and an overpriced non-stick skillet he thought looked professional. 30 minutes later, the kitchen was a battlefield. The pancakes were misshapen, too thick, and somehow burned on both sides. Flour dusted the counter like snow. A cracked egg sat untouched in the sink. He stared at the plate in frustration. Ava walked in, rubbing her eyes. She blinked at the sight. Dorian straightened his back. "I made pancakes." She looked at the plate, then at him. "They look interesting." He smirked. "That bad?" "No," she said with a shrug, sliding into a chair. "Just brave." Caleb followed next, more curious than hungry. He didn't say much, just sat at the table, watching silently as Dorian set the lopsided stack in front of them. Alara entered last. One glance at the scene told her everything. He looked at her apologetically. "I think I missed a step." She raised an eyebrow. "Several." They all sat. The pancakes were edible, barely. Syrup helped. But the room was filled with something Dorian hadn't known he'd been craving. Sound. Chewing. Laughing. Alara reminding Ava to chew slower. Caleb poking his fork at the edge of the plate and asking, "You really cooked this?" And then, when no one expected it, Ava grinned. "Can we do this again next weekend?" The days that followed were full of firsts. He walked Ava to her art club, her hand barely touching his sleeve at first. Then staying there as she talked about a drawing she was working on. He sat at the back of Caleb's science fair, surrounded by rows of parents in jeans and windbreakers, clapping clumsily as Caleb showed off a homemade battery made from lemons. He read bedtime stories, poorly. He mixed up character voices, mispronounced simple names. Ava corrected him with exaggerated sighs. Still, they asked for another chapter. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, Dorian stood in the hallway, listening to the faint sound of their laughter through the door, and something inside him, something cold and long forgotten, finally began to thaw. Sunday afternoons became their unofficial movie time. Popcorn burned on the first try. Dorian put too much salt on the second. By the third week, Caleb had taken over the process, declaring himself popcorn captain, and enforcing rules like no talking during the trailers and Dad has to sit in the middle. Dorian didn't mind. Not one bit. He learned how Ava liked her sandwiches. No crusts, triangle cut, not square. He learned that Caleb collected pebbles from places he visited, each with its own code name based on how it felt in his pocket. He learned that if he was more than 5 minutes late, Ava would worry silently, and Caleb would act like he didn't care, until Dorian apologized. The house began to shift. His presence wasn't met with silence anymore. It was expected. There were moments that caught him off guard, like the time Caleb handed him a school project, My Family Tree, and had drawn. Him in the bottom corner, labeled carefully Dad, joined when we were 8. Dorian stared at the paper for a long time. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. There was no rewriting history, no pretending he'd always been there. But he was there now, and they saw it. Ava once handed him a note after dinner. It was written on lined notebook paper in purple pen. You make terrible pancakes, but you're trying really hard, and that counts. Love, Ava. He kept a note in his wallet. Nights were his favorite. Bedtime stories were smoother now. He still messed up the voices, but the kids didn't care. Caleb would correct him mid-sentence. Ava would curl into Alara's side while Dorian sat cross-legged on the floor, reading from a book she'd already memorized. Alara sometimes stayed in the hallway, letting the three of them find their rhythm. Sometimes she stayed in the room, watching with quiet eyes that said nothing but felt like everything. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Dorian stepped out onto the porch. Alara followed, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "They're warming up to you," she said. "I don't deserve that," he replied. "Maybe not," she said softly. "But you're earning it." They stood in silence for a while. Dorian looked through the living room window, at the scattered toys, the bookshelf with Ava's drawings taped to it, the cluttered coffee table with Caleb's pebble jar half spilled. He smiled faintly. "This," he whispered, mostly to himself, "this is what I was missing." If you believe presence matters more than presence, drop a heart in the comments. Let's remind each other that showing up, consistently, fully, is the most powerful kind of love. It started with small moments, a shared glance across the kitchen, a brief smile exchanged over the children's laughter. Simple things that once meant nothing, now meant everything. Alara didn't rush anything. She didn't lean in just because he was trying. She had spent years building a home with no one to lean on, and she wasn't going to let old memories write a new future without proof that it was real. But she let him walk beside her. That was enough, for now. On Wednesdays, they took walks after dinner while the kids watched their favorite show. Sometimes through the neighborhood, sometimes to the small park down the road. They didn't always talk, but when they did, it was slow, natural. He told her about the stress he used to wear like armor. The long nights staring at city lights through penthouse windows, mistaking noise for meaning. She told him about bedtime routines, scraped knees, late bills, and the moments she thought she wouldn't make it, but always did. "I used to imagine what you'd say if you walked through that door," she said once, their steps in sync under the streetlights. "Most nights, I stopped before I could finish the thought." He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "I should have been there." "I know." One night, after the kids had gone to bed and the house had settled, Alara sat on the porch swing. Dorian stepped outside, holding 2 cups of tea. One made the way she always liked it, barely sweet, with a hint of lemon. She raised an eyebrow. "I remember," he said quietly, offering it to her. They sat in silence for a while. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of things that didn't need to be spoken yet. She finally asked, "Do you ever regret it, choosing that world over this?" His jaw tightened. "I used to think I couldn't afford to slow down, that if I stopped, even for a second, I'd lose everything." He paused, eyes on the dark sky. "I just didn't realize what I was losing by running so fast." The tea had gone cold in their hands, but neither of them moved. Dorian turned slightly toward her, the words forming slowly. "I'm sorry, Alara." He didn't say it like a man trying to clear his conscience. He said it like someone finally understanding the full cost of what had been lost. "I was so focused on building something that I forgot what I was building it for." Alara didn't speak right away. She'd heard apologies before, from people who only meant to ease their own guilt. But this one didn't ask for anything. It simply sat there, heavy and honest. "I used to wait for that," she said after a moment. He looked at her. "I waited, not just for you to say it, but to mean it." She took a breath, eyes forward. "But this isn't just about you and me anymore." He nodded. "I know. You hurt me," she said plainly, "not to wound, but to name it. I know that too. And you weren't there for them. Not once. Not even accidentally." His jaw tightened. He took it. She looked at him fully now. "If you're here just to fix what we had, that won't be enough. They're not a second chance at love. They're not your redemption arc. They're people," he said, finishing her thought. "Yes." He nodded, slowly. "I'm not going anywhere." Another silence. Then something shifted. She leaned back slightly, arms crossed, but not defensive. "Just thinking." "You know," she said softly, "when I found out I was pregnant, I cried for 3 hours. Then I laughed. Then I got angry. Then I cried again." He swallowed. "I wasn't ready to be a mother, but they didn't ask for my readiness. They just came, And they needed me. She turned her face toward him. They still need me. And now they might need you. But only if you're going to stay. I will. Not with promises. No, he said, with my life. She held his gaze for a few seconds longer. Then, she exhaled and smiled, just a little, not because everything was fixed, but because maybe, it wasn't broken beyond repair. It began with a headline. Billionaire CEO Dorian Hale linked to secret family. Source says twins are his. One article, one photo, one slanted version of the truth. Within hours, the story was everywhere. By morning, his assistant had 10 missed calls from publicists, 5 urgent messages from the firm's legal team, and a quiet one-line email from the board chair. We need to talk. Urgently. The photos weren't invasive, but they didn't need to be. A shot of Dorian stepping out of Alara's house, one of him walking through a park with Caleb, a blurry image of Ava holding his hand. No comment had been given, no confirmation needed. The speculation was enough. The man who had mastered control was now the subject of whispers. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The same people who once praised him in front of clients now avoided eye contact. One board member, Thatcher, the oldest and most traditional of them all, leaned forward with both hands on the table. We don't judge personal lives, Dorian, but you know how this works. Optics matter. Another cleared her throat. The issue isn't just the photos, it's the way they were leaked. It makes us look like we've been hiding something. It's my life, Dorian said calmly. You are the brand, Thatcher snapped. Everything you do reflects on us. He sat back in his chair, expression neutral. But inside, something burned. They hadn't cared when he worked 18-hour days, when he traveled without rest, when he sacrificed everything to grow their numbers. Now, when he'd finally found something real, they called it a problem. That evening, the firm's media consultant called him directly. I've been instructed to prepare a statement. You can either deny the claim or we shape it gently. Dorian didn't answer right away. The consultant lowered his voice. Look, off the record, everyone loves a comeback. If we play this right, you lean into the devoted father thing after the media cycle cools down. But for now, silence is better. He hung up without responding. Alara called that night. Her voice was steady, but there was a strain beneath it. We had a photographer outside the school this afternoon. Dorian sat up. Are they okay? They're fine. But Caleb noticed. He doesn't say much when he's nervous. He just watches. He closed his eyes. I'll handle it. I know you're used to fighting battles from the top of a tower, she said softly. But this one? It's happening at ground level. She was right. By the next morning, the narrative had shifted again. This time, the target wasn't just Dorian, it was Alara. Is she after his fortune? Mystery woman in Hale scandal has troubled past sources say she reappeared. Just as his company hit record valuation, the headlines weren't subtle. They weren't even creative. They were sharp, calculated, meant to sow doubt. Dorian scrolled through them, jaw tight. The articles didn't come from legitimate journalism. They were stitched together from speculation and anonymous quotes. But they spread fast. Every repost, every comment, every share was another stone thrown. And Alara? She didn't flinch publicly. She went to work. She cooked dinner. She braided Ava's hair and helped Caleb with his homework. But behind her eyes, he saw it. That quiet wall she was rebuilding, not against him, but around herself, around the children, to protect them. Again, he called an emergency meeting with the firm's crisis team. They offered solutions. Set up a clean interview. Tell your side. Distance yourself from her publicly for now, at least until Q3. We could spin this as a story of personal growth. If you control the message. He didn't respond, at least not the way they wanted him to. One executive, a man Dorian had mentored for years, took him aside after the meeting. Off the record, they don't care if it's true. They care if it makes money. If you lose your edge, you're replaceable. Dorian stared at him. Edge? Emotion looks like weakness, especially now. Dorian walked away without saying a word, but his silence wasn't passive. It was choice. That night, he showed up at Alara's house unannounced. She opened the door, not surprised. They're asleep, she said. He nodded. Can we talk? She stepped aside. In the kitchen, he reached into his coat pocket and placed his phone on the counter, face down. No statements, he said. No interviews, no spin. Ilara leaned against the wall, arms folded. I won't let them make you a story, he added. Not one you didn't choose. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, softly, that's what I was afraid of. That being with you would mean being turned into a headline. He stepped closer. Not this time. The world outside was loud, judging, watching, waiting for the narrative to shift again. But in that moment, inside that small kitchen, there was quiet. Real quiet. Not silence from absence. Silence from choosing to stay. The night had been unusually quiet. Too quiet. Dinner had passed with barely a word from either child. Ava picked at her food, offering short replies. Caleb sat with his head low, stirring his plate long after everyone had finished. Dorian cleaned the table, offered to read their usual chapter. Both declined. He didn't press, but he knew. Something had shifted. Later that evening, he passed the hallway and heard the low murmur of a news segment playing. On someone's phone, followed by a familiar name spoken in a tone that wasn't kind. Then came a voice. Caleb's. I know that's him. A pause. Ava, whispering, just turn it off. I didn't even know people hated him. Dorian stood just beyond the wall, frozen. He didn't need to hear more, but he did, because truth rarely comes when you're ready for it. That night, Ilara pulled him aside while folding laundry in the living room. They'd been reading comments, the ones under the photos, the videos. Dorian swallowed hard. I blocked every account I could, she continued. But you know how it is. They hear things, even from kids at school. He ran a hand through his hair, jaw clenched. I should have stopped this before it touched them. Ilara looked at him carefully. You can't control the world, Dorian, but you can control whether you show up when it matters. An hour later, Ava came to the doorway of the guest room where he'd been sleeping. She didn't knock. She just stood there, hugging her stuffed bear. Dorian sat up. Hey. Her voice was quiet. Are you going to leave again? The words hit harder than anything said in those boardrooms. Harder than the headlines. Harder than silence. He stood slowly, crouching down to her level. No. She looked unconvinced. People leave. They say they won't, but they do. Dorian reached out but stopped halfway. I left once. I didn't know what I was leaving, but now I do. Ava bit her lip. Is this just for now, because of the news? He shook his head slowly. This is forever. Her eyes welled, but she nodded. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back down the hall. Later that night, Dorian found Caleb sitting in the corner of his room, knees to his chest. He didn't look up. I didn't cry, he said quietly. Dorian sat beside him. It's okay if you did. I wasn't scared, Caleb added quickly. Just mad. At me? Caleb finally looked at him. No, at the people saying stuff, saying you didn't want us, that you were embarrassed. Dorian's chest tightened. I'm not. But they said. They're wrong, Dorian interrupted gently. They don't know me. They don't know you. What they think doesn't matter. Caleb blinked quickly. Dorian continued. What matters is what you know, what Ava knows, what your mom knows. I can't change the past. But I'm not walking away again. Ever. There was a long pause. Then, without saying anything more, Caleb leaned sideways, resting his head against Dorian's arm. He didn't say, I believe you. He didn't have to. Dorian sat there in the quiet. The kind of quiet that demanded no words, but everything else. Love isn't built on promises. It's built on presence. And tonight, he stayed. The air between them that evening was still. They sat across from one another in the dim-lit kitchen. No children around, no interruptions, just the hum of the fridge and the kind of silence that demanded truth. Dorian had spoken for nearly 10 minutes. He had laid out his thoughts about the media, the board, the children, the chaos outside their door. He ended with a simple phrase, I just want to fix it. Ilara folded her hands on the table. Her eyes didn't soften. They didn't harden either. They just held him. Dorian, she said, voice calm. They don't need another goodbye. The words were plain, but they broke something inside him. Because he knew she wasn't only talking about the children. She was talking about herself, about the time she walked away pregnant and unheard, about years spent hoping her children wouldn't grow up wondering why their father never came back, about never allowing herself to hate him because there wasn't room for that and survival at the same time. Alara leaned back slightly. I'm not asking you to fight for us. I'm asking if you're willing to live with us. He tilted his head, confused. She explained, there's a difference between trying to win something back and choosing to stay through every dull, ordinary, unglamorous part of it. She paused. I've done the late-night fevers alone, the lost shoes, the parent-teacher conferences, the birthdays, the scraped knees, the tears that made no sound because they knew no one would hear. Her voice never wavered. I'm not mad anymore, Dorian. I'm just clear. He stayed silent, because there was nothing to argue. He'd built an empire with vision, precision, and relentless control. But here, across from her, there was no deal to negotiate, no speech to give, no title to protect, only a choice. Be here with your life, Alara said. Not just your words, not your guilt, not your effort to make things right. She leaned forward slightly, not harsh, just steady. Be here in the mornings when no one feels like talking. Be here when they ask questions you don't know how to answer. Be here when it's boring, when it's heavy, when it's quiet. Be here when it doesn't serve your image, when it cost you something. She let that linger. Or don't be here at all. Dorian's throat tightened. He wasn't a man who cried easily. He didn't cry when the company nearly collapsed in the second year. He didn't cry when his father passed, or when he missed the funeral due to a last-minute acquisition deal. But something about this moment, this quiet, decisive moment, split him wide open. He looked at her, really looked at her, and in her face, he didn't see anger. He saw someone who had loved him once, and still might, but only if he stood all the way in. Not as the version of himself polished for the public, but as the man willing to stay for the mess, the unknown, the responsibility, the grace. He nodded slowly, not just to her words, but to everything they meant. I hear you, he said, voice rough. Alara stood, and without a word, she went to check on the children. He didn't follow, not because he wasn't ready, but because for the first time in his life, he understood that showing up doesn't always mean speaking. It means staying. The boardroom was colder than usual. Rows of suited men and women sat in tense silence as Dorian entered, his stride steady, his expression unreadable. A dozen pairs of eyes tracked him to the head of the long table. Cameras flickered silently in the corners, recording every move. This was not just a meeting, it was an evaluation. The chairman, Thatcher, cleared his throat. Mr. Hale, I assume you've seen the numbers. Investor confidence has dipped 10% in the last week. Our stock price is under pressure. The scandal, whether you call it personal or not, has become a corporate liability. Another board member chimed in. Donors are hesitant. Partners are asking questions. Your reputation has always been one of discipline, control, perfection. Now, you're compromised. The words were daggers, sharp and intentional. Dorian didn't flinch. He had heard worse in the early days, when no one believed in him. But this was different. Then he fought for an empire. Now, he was fighting for something greater. A younger executive tried to soften the edge. We're not saying you can't recover, Dorian, but we need you to reassure the market, reclaim the narrative, distance yourself from unnecessary distractions. Unnecessary distractions. The phrase echoed in his mind. They weren't talking about press leaks. They weren't talking about headlines. They were talking about Alara, about Ava, about Caleb, his family. Thatcher leaned forward. You've always been our strongest asset, but if you lose focus now, you jeopardize everything we've built. You've built. Dorian finally spoke. I haven't lost focus. Murmurs rippled across the room. He let them settle before continuing. I've found it. There was confusion, discomfort. Some exchanged glances, some scribbled notes. Dorian stood, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. His voice carried, not loud, but commanding. I know what you're expecting me to say, that this is temporary, that the company comes first, that my personal life is separate from what we've built here. He paused, scanning the table. But that's not the truth. The truth is, I spent years believing success required sacrifice, and I was wrong. The room stiffened. I'm stepping down, he said. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was shock, pure, disbelieving shock. One board member spoke sharply. You can't be serious. Another, angrier, you are this company. Without you, we lose everything. The room erupted, voices overlapping, sharp and frantic. Dorian raised a hand. His tone cut through the noise. No, you won't lose everything. You'll lose me. But what you'll gain is leadership that doesn't make the same mistake I did, believing wealth means anything without someone to share it with. The words hung heavy, undeniable. Some stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Others, like he'd revealed something they'd never dared to admit. He didn't wait for approval. This wasn't up for a vote. Dorian looked around the room one last time. These were men and women who had praised him, feared him, followed him. They had shaken his hand at victories, raised toasts in his name, bowed their heads when his decisions crushed competition. But not one of them knew his children's names. Not one of them had stood with him the night Caleb asked if he was really his father, or when Ava slipped her tiny hand into his at the school play. So no, this room no longer held his definition of success. It was only noise. He adjusted his tie, not out of habit, but closure. I came here a long time ago with nothing but an idea. I worked day and night to prove something to the world, but somewhere along the way, I forgot who I was trying to prove it to. He glanced toward the city skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Was it worth it? He asked himself aloud, and then answered, no, not at the cost of missing their first steps, their birthdays, her strength, my own peace. You say this company will fall without me. Maybe. But companies can be rebuilt. He turned to face them fully. You know what can't be rebuilt? Time, trust, childhood, the kind of love that waits for you to come home, not to your penthouse, but to your people. No one dared interrupt. I'm not abandoning this company, he said. I'm setting it free. And I'm setting myself free too. He placed a black folder on the polished table. Inside it, his official resignation letter. Effective immediately. One executive whispered, stunned, he's really doing it. Thatcher's voice broke the silence. You built this from the ground up, Dorian. You are the brand. You're walking away from power, legacy, everything. Dorian shook his head. I'm walking toward everything. He didn't look back as he left the room. Not once. Because for the first time in nearly a decade, he knew where he was going. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and there they were. Elara, Ava, Caleb, waiting, not because he was a CEO, but because he was theirs. He stepped out, loosened his tie, and knelt to their level. Caleb ran to him first, eyes wide, arms open. Ava followed, wrapping herself tightly around his neck. Dorian closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of home. When he opened them, Elara was there, watching quietly, not demanding, not questioning, just seeing him, really seeing him. I'm not going anywhere, he said to her. And he meant it. Every syllable, not as a vow, but as a decision. He stood, reached for Elara's hand, and together they walked out of the building. No press conference, no grand exit. Just a man finally stepping into the life that had waited for him all along. If you've ever had to give something up for the people you love, or you've chosen family over fortune, tell us about it in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else to do the same. The building behind him was tall, sharp, unyielding, just like the man he used to be. The moment Dorian stepped through the revolving doors, it felt like he had exhaled for the first time in years. The tie around his neck loosened on instinct, not vanity. It wasn't rebellion. It was relief. Outside, the city buzzed like it always had, cars honking, footsteps scurrying, conversations weaving through the air. But none of it touched him. None of it mattered, because they were waiting. Elara stood near the curb, one hand resting gently on Ava's shoulder. Caleb clutched her other side, scanning the glass doors, scanning the crowd, scanning the faces, hoping. When Caleb's eyes caught Dorian's, the boy didn't smile. Not right away. He just looked. It looked like he needed confirmation that this wasn't another fleeting moment, that the man walking toward him was the same one who'd burned pancakes, read bedtime, stories badly, and tried, really tried, to be more than a name on a birth certificate. Dorian didn't speak. He didn't wave. He walked slowly, eyes locked on his children, steps heavy with 1,000 unspoken words. And then, he dropped to his knees. Ava ran first, her shoes clapping against the sidewalk, arms stretched so wide they trembled. Dorian caught her like a lifeline, burying his face into her small shoulder as her arms squeezed around his neck. Caleb followed, slower, unsure. But when he reached them, he didn't hesitate. He leaned in, and Dorian pulled him close, too, holding them both like his own heart. Had split in two, and they were the only way to keep it from falling apart. Tears came, uninvited and unhidden. They slipped down his face as he whispered, "I'm home, for good, I promise." Alara watched. No words, no rush, just a quiet nod, and her eyes, strong but soft, finally let go of the guarded weight she had carried for years. There was no spotlight, no applause, no corporate ladder to climb, just a man on a sidewalk, clutching the only success that ever really mattered. A family. In that stillness, the world seemed to hush. Even the street noise faded into something distant, almost delicate, as if the moment itself demanded reverence. His hands tangled gently in Ava's curls. Caleb's head pressed against his shoulder. Alara stepped closer, kneeling beside them, her fingers resting against Dorian's back, not with force, but with understanding. No more questions, no more doubts, just presence, whole. Finally, the soil was dry, but Caleb's determination was stronger. "Dad, don't overwater it," he said with the seriousness of a botanist. Dorian blinked, holding the watering can halfway through his pour. "Wait, really? You said yesterday it needed more." "That was for the basil," Ava chimed in, from behind her sunflower pot. "This one's lavender. It's picky." He looked between his kids, confused and outnumbered. "Basil's needy. Lavender's picky," he muttered under his breath. "Got it." They giggled in unison, and Dorian, kneeling in the garden dirt in his once white sneakers, let out a full, unguarded laugh. Not polite, not restrained, a real laugh. The backyard wasn't massive, but it was enough for morning sun and evening light. Today it was buzzing with energy. Alara pulling weeds while the kids debated whether worms were cool or gross, and Dorian, for the third time that week, got his pants stained by a pot he thought was dry. At one point, he looked up and caught Alara staring, not in that old guarded way, but with a kind of stillness, a soft smile tucked beneath the corners of her lips. Her hands were covered in soil, her hair tied loosely. She looked peaceful. He stood and walked toward her. "You're staring," he said playfully. "Just watching you learn how to live," she replied. His heart swelled. Later that week, the kitchen was covered in glue sticks, glitter, poster boards, and crayons. Caleb's science fair was coming up, and Dorian had mistakenly offered to help. Now he was sitting cross-legged on the floor with a glue stick stuck to his shirt and a paper volcano that looked more like a melting traffic cone. Ava leaned over to whisper, "Mom usually does the creative stuff." "I'm trying," Dorian whispered back. "You're trying too hard," she replied, placing a neon star on his forehead. He left it there. In the evenings, the house would quiet. Books would close. Lights would dim. And Dorian would find himself sitting by the window, a child tucked under each arm, Alara curled against his side. They didn't talk much during those moments. They didn't need to. Peace didn't always come loud. One evening, while prepping dinner, Dorian was stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce. Alara leaned in from behind to reach for the salt. Their hands brushed. They both paused. Their eyes met. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned in. She didn't pull away. They kissed. No fanfare, no drama, just lips that had once known each other finding their way back. A gentle seal on the life they were now writing together. Weekends were for community events. The school had a picnic. The park hosted a local play. The town organized a cleanup day. Alara joined with her usual quiet strength. Dorian showed up, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes overdressed, sometimes asking too many questions, but always present. The townspeople took notice, not of the former CEO, but of the man hauling folding chairs, losing at beanbag toss, and clapping the loudest when Ava recited her poem. One afternoon, Dorian walked into the living room to find Ava and Caleb drawing on the floor. "What's this?" he asked. "A family portrait," Ava replied. She held it up, stick figures labeled with shaky handwriting. There was Alara, with long brown hair, Ava and Caleb, holding hands, and a man, taller, with messy black scribbles for hair and a red tie. "That's you," Caleb said proudly. Dorian stared at it for a long time. It wasn't perfect, but it was whole, and for the first time in his life, that was enough. He had once stood at the top of the world, built towers that kissed the sky, walked into rooms where his name carried weight, made decisions that moved markets. And yet, he was empty, not because he lacked wealth, but because he lacked presence. Now, he's rich, rich in ways the world can't measure. He was once a man who had everything, except what mattered. Now, he has less of the world, but more of what the heart truly craves. True wealth is love, not power. What good is a throne if no one is waiting for you at home? When children don't need perfection, they need presence. They won't remember the price tag on the toy, but they'll never forget who sat beside them on the floor to build it. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is a return, a restoration, a bridge built from pain, walked only by the brave. When strength is not in how long you can hold back emotion, but in your courage to feel it, share it, and still stand tall. And second chances? They're not just gifts. They're miracles disguised as quiet knocks on the door you thought was long closed. A hand-drawn picture pinned to the fridge, 4 stick figures with big smiles. One of them wears a red tie. Laughter echoes from the hallway. Alara calls out, "Dinner's ready." Dorian enters the frame, lifting Ava onto his shoulders, Caleb tugging at his sleeve. Everything I needed was right here. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone or made you believe, again in the power of love and redemption, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Mr. Ross Story Trail. Let's spread the kind of stories that heal, inspire, and give people hope for their own second chance.